and welcome to another session of Informally Formal. And we have with us Dr. Masrur Reaz. He is the chairman of Policy Exchange, Bangladesh. Before starting this very exciting venture, he held senior positions with IFC, World Bank Group, and has worked extensively in helping governments and institutions across the region here in South Asia, Southeast, and beyond. Very warm welcome, Dr. Masrur Reaz.
It's always a pleasure and privilege to be back in your show.
Believe it or not, the pleasure is all mine. Let's get started. Today, we're going to be talking about tax reforms. As we all know, Masrur, I'll just give a little preamble. The tax to GDP in Bangladesh has been, once we instituted the VAT program in 90s, before that, it was only at about 6.5%. Then we instituted the VAT program, it got to 10%. Then I guess the maximum we ever hit was 12%. We're talking about tax to GDP. Now, as it so happens that last year was, I believe, 8.5%. This year looks like we're going to end up at 7.5% tax to GDP. Now, if the government doesn't have enough money, how do we go about spending? How do we go about doing the massive infrastructure and bringing us up to? So anyways, people that understand what we are talking about, I guess, will understand the importance of today's topic. So Masrur, let me just ask you, of course, then my first question, which is revenue and taxes. Why are they important? What is the current state, which I've already kind of alluded to, but over to you.
So thanks for highlighting a very critical issue for Bangladesh's development, governance, as well as prosperity as part of today's topic, the tax and tax reform, or how do we move towards a congenial, conducive tax regime that helps Bangladesh to grow and prosper. So you ask the question, why is tax important, or tax reform important, or improvement in Bangladesh's current tax performance important? The most important one, you actually alluded to in your introduction. Where do the states get their money? Starting from the mighty economies of the United States and China, to middle income countries or emerging countries such as India, Vietnam, or near sort of emerging countries such as Bangladesh, Ethiopia, or even for that matter, very low income countries of the world. The revenue, domestic revenues, is a very important source, if not the most important source, for governments to manage state affairs, to provide services to their citizens, to put in place growth supporting determinants such as infrastructure, such as social services, which contribute over a long term in stimulating growth and social progress of any country, such as education, skills development, health, and so on. Now, our country, as we know, and we have talked about it in your last show as well, it has done wonders in terms of its development progress. It has come a long way in terms of economic growth, one of the fastest growing GDPs, one of the fastest growing economy in the world, with a robust, sustained GDP growth of over 6% over almost a decade, with the growth hovering around 8% in the fiscal year 19. But of course, COVID has sort of brought it down to a smaller percent in the immediate last fiscal year. But notwithstanding COVID shock in the last fiscal, Bangladesh was one of the fastest growing country, which not only grew very fast, but it maintained a very high rate of growth. Trade, manufacturing, and wage income, labor productivity. I think the country has done phenomenal. But where the country hasn't done as good is the institutional capability. And one of the key institutional capability for the governments around the world, and certainly also in Bangladesh, is its ability to raise enough revenue and then spend it or allocate those resources in growth and social good producing outcomes or into processes. Now, if you look at Bangladesh's revenue to GDP ratio or tax GDP ratio, it's quite low. For comparator countries, which stands at similar stage of economic and social development in Bangladesh, this particular number is quite low for Bangladesh. It's less than 10%, the tax GDP ratio. The revenue GDP is slightly over 10%. It is lower than even Nepal and Bhutan. It's certainly the lowest in South Asia. But what worries me, it's lower than the countries which have been or are currently at the similar stage of development or similar phase of development that Bangladesh is in. So something is not working. So it certainly constrains government's ability to spend resources or allocate resources in areas such as infrastructure, such as productivity improvement, such as civil service capacity development, such as education and health, which are going to be critical determinants of our further prosperity and growth. So that's one. Number two, why tax is important or improvement in taxation regime is important is to create a better investment climate. The growth that Bangladesh has secured so far has been broad-based and comparatively inclusive. But what is really great about it, not unique in Bangladesh, but it has done it much more strongly in Bangladesh, it is private sector-led growth. And going forward, the participation and the role of private sector in driving the growth to that of above 8%, to drive private investment to GDP ratio to that of near or above 30%, to bring in the FDI that we need for technology transfer, market diversification in our exports, product quality improvement. The investment climate is going to be critical. And for one, where it's going to be absolutely critical for Bangladesh's development aspiration is the ability of Bangladesh government or policymakers to help create the more than 2 million jobs that are required to absorb the youths that come to the job market every year and the quality of those jobs. Now for that, what is absolutely critical is private investment. Bangladesh has done well over the decades, but it needed to do better.
It's not just in Bangladesh, tax systems are such that there are loopholes and stuff like that. So there is on one side, we need to increase the tax net, right? So we cover more people, so the base is larger. But then at the same time, we also need to make it equitable to where, is it gonna be a progressive? We do have a progressive taxation system. To what extent are we gonna make the rich pay their fair share of the tax system? So in your opinion, Masrur, what are some of the, I would say, best practices in terms of a tax system?
I think, as you say very rightly, tax is something that is not easy. Anywhere in the world, people do feel a little hesitation in paying more taxes. Increasing a tax GDP ratio or tax base or tax collection, I think it needs to be a two-pronged approach. On one hand, without proper enforcement measures or effective enforcement measures, there will always be people who will not pay tax despite their obligation or qualification to actually pay tax or higher tax. So that's enforcement. But enforcement alone as well cannot do it. The second part, the complementary part of the two-pronged strategy is the governments have to create an atmosphere where compliance becomes easier and compliance become actually a fun thing, right? So what does it require? A number of foundations that you can bring in to make both compliance better, easier, as well as enforcement effective. First of all, your tax administration, your tax policy, which is the tax laws and provisions and which sets the obligations and so on, and the way that those are enforced, the tax administration part, the collection part, they need to be such that they don't actually add unnecessary formal or informal costs to the business of tax payment or to business of tax compliance. Because if unnecessary or avoidable costs are there, either in the form of rates or taxes or types of taxes, or in the procedures which determine or govern the compliance, people do get demotivated. Because in any case, no human being loves paying a part of their hard-earned income to anybody else, right? So we have to think about that. So the cost, the tax policy and administration has to be structured in a way there are no unnecessary costs or there are no avoidable costs, number one. Number two, procedural fairness. Again, it is, it is about someone paying part of their hard-earned money to another entity, government in this case. Of course, part of it comes back in the form of public services, but that's much more diffused and later on. So the procedural fairness has to be there. How do you file taxes? How do you file your returns? How do you pay? How do you get your audits done? How do you get your tax credits done? All of these procedures need to be very friendly and very fair. They cannot actually make discrimination between taxpayers, certainly not towards smaller taxpayers and smaller businesses. Thirdly, discretion and discrimination. This is something that is actually a much talked about concern of taxpayers, particularly business taxpayers. Around the world, certainly in countries where the tax system is weaker, that the tax officials often take advantage of discretionary powers which are allowed to them through inefficient tax policies. That leads to harassment or discrimination. So again, that would discourage and that would genuinely put into disadvantage taxpayers, particularly business taxpayers. I would also say what is important is transparency into this whole process. Why you're paying tax, why you are being asked for certain amount, whether your self-assessment is respected or not, as long as you have met the procedures and as long as you've gone through all the right ways. And then what is also important is for the better compliance, what we call taxpayer outreach and taxpayer education. A lot of the problems are with the tax authorities, but oftentimes problems also lie with the taxpayers. Most people around the world believe that there probably should have been more taxes on the part of the taxpayer who perhaps have gone for either evasion or avoidance. So now, how do you motivate people to pay a percentage or a share of their hard-earned income to actually a government? Now, the taxpayer, it doesn't happen automatically. If we just think there is a law and the law obliges anybody who's earning money within a certain category to come and voluntarily pay tax, that doesn't happen anywhere in the world. Taxpayer needs better outreach from tax authorities. Tax authorities need to start considering them not only as taxpayer, but also as partners or as stakeholders or as clients. And part of that client development or sort of client relationship development is, how you reach out to them. What do you reach out to them with? And part of that, what you reach out to them with is actually the taxpayer education and taxpayer motivation. You need to put in place communication campaigns, strategic communications as tax authorities to continuously expand the understanding of taxpayers, particularly potential taxpayers who need to understand the nitty-gritties of tax, who also need to understand the big pictures and the motivation behind tax and the obligations of the citizen and the benefits the citizens ultimately get when the tax collection goes up and the state's ability to actually do more in the form of public services and growth supporting services. And finally, I think a best practice these days is actually better. I mentioned about fair procedures or procedural fairness, but with that, a part of the best practice is also better enforcement tools such as audits, investigations, quicker processing, and so on. So for that, what is working very well in developed countries, but in many developing countries as well, such as Uganda, is integrated revenue management services, whereby technology is brought in as a great enabler.
That was pretty comprehensive, really, Masrur. You covered quite a bit, really. Thank you so much. One thing though, this is what I believe, right? With all these, not just with taxes, with most everything in life, when we create a system, I'm going back to the root. We create a system that is not so kosher And then we have to then, to counter that, we have to create laws. And then this will again, this is like a cat and mouse game, The other thing, in my show on business ethics and corruption and stuff, here is something that came up. When a child is born, from the very get-go, if they're taught that money is God, if that's what they're taught, and it's how they're taught that? Because family members at dinner tables and stuff, all they talk about is so-and-so bought that car. So-and-so got a Rolex. So-and-so. So they're not directly telling you, but that's all they're talking about. I would wish to see at some point in Bangladesh where we fundamentally change the way we educate our children. So when they grow up to be more responsible citizens. So they don't want to skirt the law to pay less. And the ones that are enforcing that hopefully are also a lot fairer and what have you. But till we get to that stage, Masrur, I guess we'll have to have good reforms in place, good practices in place, and all of the things that you mentioned.
I just wanted to echo what you have said. There is no bigger learning than what you learn from family, what you learn from society, and what you learn as a student in your primary schools. I think that sets the foundation for all your subsequent learning as well as your mindset. So I totally agree with you that some of the tax problems need to be sorted out in the form of reforms in tax policy, tax administration, bringing in ICT technology and so on. But a lot of those are actually much longer term societal reforms. I think there is a need for Bangladesh's education system to reorient itself and actually prepare the students not only as good academic students, but also good global and country citizens, whereby you learn about your responsibilities to other human beings, to society, and to states. And that's where I think your point is absolutely important. And secondly, I'll just say one more thing. If there is one reform which can be considered as probably the mother of all tax revenue, to improve the revenue systems in the country, that would be separation of this tax policy and tax administration being concentrated, both authorities being concentrated under one institution, that is National Board of Revenue.
Masrur, I am so glad that you brought that up, because that is something that has been in the back of our minds. Many of us have discussed that in the past, that is something, that separation of duty must happen, because it's a pure conflict of interest. So with that, Masrur, I would like to thank you for joining us, for your precious time, and look forward to having you back many more times, because I love talking to you, love picking your brain. I think you bring a lot of substance to these discussions. And with that, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us. Stay safe. With that, I sign off. I'll catch you in the next session. Bye-bye.